June 17, 1944. Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. The morning sun was already a hammer, beating down on the volcanic ridges and shattered palms that crowned the island. The jungle stank of rot and cordite, a mix of burned palm oil, gunpowder, and the faint metallic taste of blood that still lingered in the humid air. American Marines, their faces streaked with grime and salt, moved cautiously through the ruins of a captured Japanese position. Private First Class Harold Red Miller of the 2nd Marine Division crouched behind a fallen banyan tree, wiping sweat from his neck with a filthy bandana. He'd been on Saipan for 4 days now, 4 days of artillery, ambushes, and screams echoing through the night. But this morning, for the first time since the landing, something else rode the wind. A smell. He froze, sniffed, and blinked in disbelief. "Bacon," he muttered. Corporal Jim O'Donnell, trudging behind him with his bar slung low, let out a low whistle. "You gotta be kidding me. Bacon? Out here?" A few yards away, down near the shoreline, white tents fluttered in the sea breeze. Jeeps moved in and out, hauling crates stamped USN Logistics Command. And in the middle of it all, a dozen cooks in aprons stood over steel ranges and bubbling pots, part of a Navy field kitchen that had landed with the supplies 2 nights earlier. The smell of sizzling fat, eggs, and coffee drifted through the ruined village, a surreal comfort against the backdrop of blackened bunkers and dead banyan trees. Nearby, hidden in a cave just above the tree-line, a group of surviving Japanese soldiers watched in stunned silence. Sergeant Matsuo Takahashi pressed a shaking hand against his stomach. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His men were pale, gaunt, and covered in mosquito bites. Their last rations, moldy rice and dried fish, had been devoured long before the Americans stormed the beach. Now, as the rich aroma of cooked food wafted up from the U.S. encampment, it felt like a cruel dream. One of his men whispered hoarsely, "They're cooking? In the middle of a battle?" Takahashi said nothing. He simply stared at the American camp below, where men laughed and passed tin mugs of steaming coffee, their rifles leaning casually nearby. He couldn't understand it. In the Imperial Army, food was survival, not comfort. On these islands, starvation was a companion. Men fought on empty stomachs until their hands trembled too much to hold a rifle. And yet the Americans, they ate like it was Sunday morning back home. Down at the camp, a young Navy cook named Ensign Robert Greeley was organizing breakfast lines. Behind him, a pair of Seabees were unloading new crates from an amphibious truck, powdered eggs, condensed milk, canned fruit, and even ice blocks wrapped in sawdust and burlap. The ice shimmered faintly in the tropical heat, a small miracle hauled across thousands of miles of ocean. "Get your trays ready, boys," Greeley called out, voice half drowned by the surf. "Hot chow for everyone, bacon, beans, and biscuits. Fresh off the stove." The Marines cheered, some laughing, some too tired to do more than grin. They had fought through hell to reach this beachhead. Now, for a brief moment, they were human again. A few feet away, a Navy engineer lifted a lid from a steel drum. Inside was a churn of white frost and cream, a batch of ice cream, made right there on the island. "Vanilla," he said proudly. "Just like home." By noon, word of the ice cream had spread through the entire division. Men lined up with mess tins, unable to believe what they were seeing. On Saipan, an island where Japanese snipers still hid in the hills and artillery thundered inland, they were eating ice cream. Meanwhile, in the caves above, Takahashi and his men could only watch. One of them broke down quietly, tears cutting through the dirt on his cheeks. "Even their food is cold," he whispered. "Even here." As the afternoon sun beat down, the difference between the two armies became painfully clear. One side was fueled by an empire of logistics, floating kitchens, refrigerated ships, and supply lines stretching back across the Pacific. The other survived on rationed hope, their discipline masking gnawing hunger. The battle for Saipan had shown who could fight, but it would also reveal who could endure. And for the Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured, the sight of Americans eating hot meals and scooping ice cream in a war zone would be something they'd never forget. August 1944. Somewhere in the Central Pacific, aboard the U.S. Navy's Service Squadron 10. The sea was calm that morning, the horizon a silver haze where water met sky. Sailors moved briskly along the deck of an enormous auxiliary vessel, a logistical marvel that looked more like a floating city than a warship. It was one of dozens of support ships in the U.S. Navy's vast supply armada, the unseen force behind the island-hopping campaign. And tied up beside it, bobbing gently in the Pacific swell, was something that no other navy in history had ever built, an ice cream barge. Officially, it was designated a floating refrigeration unit, but the men knew it by its real name, the ice cream ship. Inside, compressors hummed and pipes rattled as sailors in white aprons worked among rows of metal vats and cooling units. The air was freezing, and their breath fogged as they moved between stacks of canned milk, sugar, and powdered cream. Every few hours, batches of ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, or coffee flavor, were churned out in 50-gallon drums, stored in cold lockers, and then ferried out to nearby fleet vessels. For the sailors of the Pacific, those shipments meant more than dessert. They meant home. Chief Petty Officer Frank Tex Dawson, a broad-shouldered man from Houston, leaned against the railing with a tin bowl of chocolate ice cream in one hand. "Hell," he said to no one in particular, "we're fightin' a war and eatin' like kings. My old man didn't have it this good in the Depression." Nearby, a young radioman grinned. The Japs wouldn't believe this if they saw it. He wasn't wrong. Thousands of miles away, in the caves of Peleliu and the jungles of New Guinea, Japanese soldiers were rationing their last handfuls of rice. Supply ships from Japan had been sunk, air routes severed. Men survived on boiled palm roots, lizards, or whatever they could catch in the jungle. American intelligence reports later recorded captured diaries filled with despair. One entry, found on a dead Japanese private, read, "We are weak with hunger. The enemy eats meat every day. I cannot understand how they have so much." On the ice cream barge, the Navy's cooks continued their work, laughing as they turned cranks and packed fresh batches. Occasionally, a carrier or destroyer would radio in, requesting 200 gallons for crew morale. Within hours, small boats were loaded and dispatched, delivering the frozen treasure across the fleet. Rear Admiral William R. Carter, commander of the service squadron, had been one of the architects behind this logistical miracle. He knew that feeding an army was as important as arming it. "Morale," he said in a letter home, "runs on full stomachs." Each day, the squadron provided the Pacific Fleet with thousands of tons of supplies, ammunition, oil, spare parts, and now, luxuries. Refrigerated barges brought fresh meat, milk, and vegetables to places so remote they didn't even appear on maps. Destroyers could resupply while still underway, and even the smallest outposts were delivered ice blocks to preserve food and water. The Japanese never truly grasped the scale of this machine. Their doctrine prized endurance and sacrifice, not comfort. Yet as one Japanese prisoner later admitted to his American interrogators, "We could not understand how you could eat fresh bread, meat, and ice while fighting. We thought it was magic. Magic, or perhaps something more powerful, industrial might." From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, the U.S. military had transformed logistics into a weapon. Factories back home churned out not just tanks and planes, but everything else a soldier might need, from ice cream mix to field ovens, from portable showers to Coca-Cola bottling units. In the midst of this, even the smallest comforts carried enormous psychological weight. Ice cream on a battleship was a reminder of America itself, of diners, baseball, summer nights, and life beyond the war. It wasn't just about calories, it was about connection. And soon, those comforts would follow the Marines ashore, into some of the most brutal fighting the Pacific had ever seen. February 21, 1945. Iwo Jima. The air was thick with sulfur and smoke, a choking haze that turned the sky the color of burnt iron. The volcanic sand crunched underfoot like black glass, swallowing boots and refusing to give them back. The island reeked of gunpowder, oil, and death. Private First Class Harold Red Miller, the same Marine who'd first smelled bacon back on Saipan, was back in the fight. This time, he was crouched in a shell hole near the northern face of Mount Suribachi, his M1 Garand clutched tight against his chest. "Jesus," he muttered as another mortar round thundered somewhere up ahead. "Feels like the whole damn island's on fire." Around him, the world was chaos. Smoke rose from shattered pillboxes, and the crash of naval guns offshore echoed like distant thunder. Medics shouted over the din, dragging wounded men to the rear. Yet somewhere beyond the cacophony, Red caught the faint clang of pots and pans, the rhythmic, almost domestic sound of metal striking metal. He turned to see a Marine cook, his uniform scorched and spattered with grease, crouched behind a steel crate, stirring a large pot balanced precariously on a makeshift stove. Steam billowed up, carrying the unmistakable scent of stew. "You gotta be kiddin' me," Red said, blinking. "You're cookin'? Here." The cook grinned through a soot-smeared face. "You want it cold?" That night, as the temperature dropped and the volcanic ash blew across the beach, the Marines lined up for what seemed like a miracle: hot chow in a war zone. Field kitchens, hauled ashore by the Navy's Seabees, had begun operating just days after the landing. Using portable stoves and insulated food containers, they served up coffee, stew, beans, and biscuits, simple meals, but piping hot. Each bowl was a defiance of misery, a declaration that the Marines would not only survive but live, even here, in hell. Up in the caves of Suribachi, Japanese Captain Ichiro Tanaka watched through binoculars, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His men, filthy and hollow-eyed, huddled in tunnels with little more than dried rice balls and rainwater to sustain them. They had been fighting non-stop for 3 days. Sleep and food were luxuries they no longer expected. One of his subordinates whispered, "They have steam, they are boiling something." Tanaka lowered his binoculars. "They eat like men on holiday." But there was no holiday for the Americans. The meals were brief, often eaten under fire. Men spooned stew from tin cups while shells whistled overhead, or gulped coffee before sprinting back into the black sand. Still, the psychological power was immense. A Marine might lose friends, lose sleep, lose the feeling in his feet, but a hot meal reminded him of life beyond the island. A war correspondent embedded with the 5th Marine Division later wrote, "You could tell when the chow line opened. Faces changed. Men stood straighter. The sound of gunfire didn't matter so much for a few minutes. They weren't just surviving, they were living." Meanwhile, Navy engineers offshore were experimenting with something new: refrigerated landing craft that could bring fresh supplies directly onto the beaches. Frozen meat, milk, vegetables, and ice were unloaded and distributed, even while Japanese artillery rained down from the cliffs. The Japanese defenders couldn't believe it. Their entire supply system depended on endurance and scavenging, hunting, foraging, and rationing. For the Americans, it was efficiency and abundance. By the end of the battle, over 70,000 Marines had eaten hot meals on Iwo Jima. The same volcanic ash that swallowed their boots had also absorbed the drippings of 1,000 field stoves. For the Japanese survivors, captured or surrendering weeks later, it was the final humiliation. One prisoner stared blankly as he was handed a steaming tin of coffee. His voice trembled as he asked through an interpreter, "You have this every day?" The Marine pouring his cup shrugged. "Pretty much." March 1945. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands. In a lagoon the size of New York Harbor, the U.S. Navy had built something extraordinary, a floating base so vast that it could repair, refuel, and rearm an entire fleet without ever touching land. Hundreds of ships were anchored in turquoise water: destroyers, oilers, repair tenders, ammunition ships, and supply barges, each part of a logistical machine unlike anything the world had seen before. To the casual observer, it looked chaotic, cranes swinging, barges weaving, men shouting over the roar of engines. But beneath the noise was order, a precision born of industrial might and meticulous planning. Commander Henry Wells, head of supply operations for Service Squadron 10, stood on the deck of his command ship and watched as yet another line of cargo ships arrived from Hawaii. Each vessel carried something essential: powdered milk, canned peaches, meat, flour, coffee, and even thousands of gallons of ice cream mix. "Every bite those Marines eat out there," Wells said to his adjutant, "starts here." The adjutant nodded, glancing at a chart pinned to the wall of their operations cabin. It was covered in arrows stretching across the Pacific, from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, from there to Eniwetok, then to Ulithi, and finally to the front lines at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. A vast conveyor belt of sustenance, moving across 10,000 miles of ocean. Back in Japan's shrinking empire, the situation was the opposite. Allied submarines had strangled their supply lines. Food, ammunition, and medicine rarely reached the garrisons scattered across the Pacific. Some islands hadn't received a single shipment in months. Soldiers hunted rats or dug up roots to survive. American intelligence reports described intercepted Japanese messages pleading for rice, salt, even simple bandages. Many were never answered. Wells looked out across the lagoon and smiled grimly. "You can't fight on an empty stomach," he muttered. "That's a lesson they never learned." Nearby, a Navy tugboat was towing an enormous barge, one of the new reefer barges, equipped with electric refrigeration. Inside its cold compartments were frozen meats, butter, and tubs of pre-made ice cream, all bound for frontline ships. To keep things running, the Navy had created floating ice plants, bakeries, repair shops, even laundries, all operating on the water. Ships could pull alongside, take on supplies, and return to battle within hours. It wasn't glamorous. There were no medals for the men who maintained the refrigeration lines or stirred batter in the sweltering kitchens. But without them, the war could not have been won. Lieutenant Charles Becker, who supervised a mobile bakery unit, recalled later. "We baked 40,000 loaves of bread a day. The smell drifted across the water. Sailors said it reminded them of home. Sometimes I think that smell did more for morale than any general speech." The Japanese prisoners later called it the other war, a war not of bullets and bombs, but of boxes and barrels. And it was a war America was destined to win. When Japanese troops on Peleliu or Leyte watched the Americans unloading fresh supplies, their disbelief turned to dread. How could they hope to defeat an enemy who brought ice cream to the front line? As one captured officer said during interrogation, "You were fighting with machines, with ships, with food, we were fighting with our bodies." That was the difference. By the spring of 1945, that difference was irreversible. American logistics had become a living organism, self-sustaining, adaptive, unstoppable. The U.S. could move entire divisions across oceans, feed them 3 hot meals a day, and still have enough left over to hand out cigarettes and chocolate bars. And wherever the Marines went, comfort followed, sometimes just behind the front lines, sometimes right into the heart of the fire. But perhaps nowhere did this contrast become more striking than in Okinawa, where American abundance met Japanese desperation head-on, under skies filled with death. April 1945. Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands. Rain fell in endless sheets over the shattered hills. The ground had turned to black sludge, swallowing boots and sucking at every step. Artillery thundered without pause, and the humid air carried the constant drone of flies circling over corpses that the downpour could not wash away. The Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest of the Pacific Campaign, had begun. And amid that chaos, the contrast between the two armies had never been more staggering. Private First Class Harold Red Miller, gaunt now, eyes hollow from months of fighting, sat in a muddy foxhole halfway up the Shuri line. His poncho was slick with rain, his rifle coated in grime. For 3 days, his unit had fought through torrential weather and mortar fire, surviving on what they could grab between firefights. Then, on the morning of April 10, a rumble echoed behind the line, not artillery, but engines. Out of the fog came a convoy of amphibious trucks, their green hulls caked in mud, each bearing the white star of the U.S. Army. "Holy hell," muttered Red, shielding his eyes from the rain. They made it through. The trucks rolled into the staging area and began unloading steel containers, field kitchens, each fitted with gasoline burners and insulated vats. Navy Seabees and Army quartermasters leapt down, shouting orders and uncrating supplies, sacks of flour, tins of fruit, canned meat, barrels of coffee. Within an hour, smoke and steam were rising again, this time from stoves, not shellfire. The smell of hot food drifted through the drizzle like a promise. "Grab your mess kits, Marines," yelled a sergeant. "Chow's up." Red stumbled over, half laughing, half disbelieving. He hadn't tasted anything hot in days. What waited for him was a simple stew, beef, beans, onions, ladled steaming into his tin tray. The first bite burned his tongue and filled his chest with something close to joy. Around him, men were laughing, cursing, crying. The world, for a few minutes, wasn't just mud and death. "Best damn meal I ever had," Red said through a mouthful, rain running down his face. Not far away, hidden deep inside the limestone caves of southern Okinawa, Japanese Sergeant Kenji Sato huddled with his remaining platoon. They were starving. Their supply lines had been obliterated weeks ago by American airstrikes. Their food, what little remained, consisted of rotting rice mixed with powdered tea leaves and rainwater. Sato had lost count of the men who had died of hunger or illness. The living were skeletal, their faces hollow, their eyes sunken. Some had begun to hallucinate. When the wind shifted and the smell of American cooking drifted through the damp air, it was torture. One of Sato's soldiers whispered, "They eat hot food?" Sato nodded grimly. "They can. They have ships. Machines. Ice. We have only faith. Faith and desperation." Outside the caves, U.S. engineers were erecting refrigerated tents, insulated units powered by portable generators, capable of storing milk, butter, and ice cream. Each division had mobile bakeries producing thousands of loaves a day. Even in the middle of the most violent battle of the Pacific, American troops ate fresh bread and drank hot coffee. To the Japanese soldiers who surrendered, it was beyond comprehension. A young prisoner, captured near Shuri Castle, stared blankly as a Marine offered him a biscuit. His voice shook as he spoke through the interpreter. "Your army eats like gods. We are ghosts." For many American troops, that realization, that their comfort came from an empire of steel and factories, was sobering. They began to understand the true scale of what sustained them: tens of thousands of men behind the lines, hundreds of ships, and millions of workers back home. And yet, amid all that abundance, the Marines never took it for granted. They knew that every hot meal, every cup of coffee, had been carried across an ocean where Japanese submarines still prowled, where supply ships still burned. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Pappy" Johnson of the 6th Marine Division later wrote in his diary, "When the chow trucks roll up under fire, you realize what power really is. Not firepower, but the power to feed your men while shells fall around you." The Japanese never stood a chance against that. By the time Okinawa fell in June 1945, nearly 200,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were dead or missing. The American troops, though battered and exhausted, were fed, clothed, and supplied to the very end. To the surviving Japanese prisoners, the abundance of the American military, the hot meals, the cold ice cream, the fresh bread baked in the rain, became a haunting symbol of the war's futility. For them, the Americans' comfort wasn't just a luxury. It was proof that the Empire of Japan could never match the industrial, logistical, and psychological strength of the United States. And for the Marines, it was proof of something simpler: that even in hell, a warm meal could make a man remember who he was fighting to get home to. August 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The war was ending. The news had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Japan had surrendered. From the deck of every ship, from every base and airfield, men cheered, wept, and hugged one another beneath skies now cleared of bombers. The thunder of artillery had gone silent, replaced by the hum of engines and the rustle of palm trees in the wind. Private First Class Harold Red Miller sat cross-legged outside a Quonset hut overlooking the blue expanse of Opera Harbor. In his hands was a tin bowl filled with vanilla ice cream, soft, melting fast in the tropical heat. He took a spoonful and smiled. "You know," he said to the Navy cook sitting beside him, "I think I dreamed about this since Saipan." The cook, Ensign Robert Greeley, the same man who'd dished out the first ice cream months before, chuckled. "Guess dreams come true, Marine." Around them, the base was alive with celebration. Marines and sailors lined up outside makeshift kitchens, where cooks worked overtime to churn out gallons of ice cream for victory parties. Some men mixed it with Coca-Cola to make floats, others simply devoured it straight from the drum. After years of heat, blood, and hunger, there was laughter again. But not everyone was laughing. A few miles away, in a fenced compound under guard, hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war sat quietly in the shade. Many were emaciated, their uniforms hanging in tatters. They had been captured on Okinawa, or pulled from lifeboats after their ships went down. Most had not eaten properly in months. Now, American medics and supply officers were distributing food, real food. Bowls of stew, rice, bread, and yes, even ice cream. When the first tubs were brought into the compound, the reaction was disbelief. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, the same man who had starved in the caves of Okinawa, watched as the prisoners ahead of him received small cups of something pale and cold. When his turn came, he hesitated, looking down at the melting cream. He glanced up at the Marine who had handed it to him. "This is food?" he asked in halting English. The Marine nodded. "Yeah. Ice cream." Sato took a small bite, and froze. His eyes widened. The sweetness was overwhelming, the cold shocking against his tongue. He had never tasted anything like it. All around him, his fellow prisoners were murmuring in awe. Some smiled faintly for the first time in months. Others wept. A Navy interpreter observing the scene wrote later in his journal. "They could not comprehend that our soldiers had eaten this on the battlefield. To them, it was impossible that such luxury existed amid war. They looked at us as if we had come from another world." And in a way, they were right. The American war machine had spanned oceans, mobilized millions, and fed its armies with the efficiency of an industrial god. From Kansas dairy farms to Chicago canneries, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the ice plants of Pearl Harbor, every hand back home had built the comfort that followed the Marines ashore. The war had been won not only with bullets and bombs, but with bacon grease, hot coffee, and ice cream churns humming on distant shores. As the sun dipped below the Pacific horizon, Red Miller leaned back against the hut, watching the sky turn gold and crimson. He finished the last spoonful of his ice cream and exhaled slowly. "Funny," he said quietly. "We came all this way to fight for freedom, and what I'll remember most is the food." Greeley laughed. "That's America for you. We fight hard, and we eat better." Across the harbor, the ships of the Pacific Fleet gleamed in the fading light. Somewhere among them, the ice cream barges were still at work, churning batch after batch. The war might have been over, but the machinery of comfort, the proof of America's vast reach, kept on running. And for the Japanese who had once seen American soldiers eating hot meals amid the fire and chaos of battle, the lesson was unforgettable. Victory, they realized, didn't just belong to the strongest or the bravest, but to the nation that could feed its men like kings in the middle of hell.